there's also prostitution and gambling and like luxury hotels and stuff like that. And that just
the three pillars of a society.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Welcome to Sincast, presented by Cinemasins.
All right, everybody, welcome to the Sincast. This is Chris Atkinson from Cinemasins, joined as always by the voice of Cinemasins, Jeremy Scott.
Hello.
And from Music Video Sins, Barrett Scher.
Hello, everyone.
And today we have a very special guest.
That's right.
Oh, my God.
Sci-fi writing badass, Andy Weir.
Hey! Hi, guys.
Hi.
If you didn't know, Andy Weir wrote The Martian, which was turned into an awesome movie that Jeremy's seen 500 times.
Yes.
I've seen it probably only half that, so I'm not nearly the fan he is. And also just last year published the book Artemis, which is also right now on track to possibly be a movie.
You never know.
You never know.
You never know.
But currently, maybe, possibly, Lord and Miller will be directing that.
That was the latest news I had heard.
They are signed on to direct, and we have Geneva Robinson Dworet working on the screenplay right now.
Who is like super red hot right now? Like has
she wrote the upcoming Captain Marvel movie. Yeah,
Excellent. Golly, so it's in good hands.
It's in very good hands, and you just gotta kind of hope. You never know with Hollywood, and the stars have to align, and everything has to work out just right for a movie to end up getting greenlit. So I'm just kind of, and as the writer of a book, you're just kind of an excited spectator on the sidelines going, yay.
Well, that's one of the things I wanted to ask you is is it hard to sort of let go of your baby and let these other creative people in this other medium play around in your world? Do you find that easy? I think it's probably different for every writer.
For me, it's pretty easy because I always consider myself a writer of books. Like my job is to write books. If their job is to make movies out of books or make original content movies, but that nobody makes original content movies anymore. But their job is to make movies. So yeah, and also, I mean, when you come down to the money end of things, first off, they gave me a big pile of money, so that really buys off a lot of anxiety. And then the other thing is, still, real jokes aside, when you're talking about money, my bread and butter comes from book sales.
Mm-hmm.
So, and nobody, there's just it's in the public zeitgeist that like if a movie sucks, people will go like, oh, it's not as good as the book, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm in the clear no matter what happens. Now in the case of The Martian, I got just incredibly lucky in that it just like. First off, it was like a very true adaptation of the book. And second off, it was just like a really, really good movie.
Yeah.
Like, they did a really good job. So it was just every aspect of it was positive. It was like a charmed project from the start.
That was Drew Goddard, right?
Drew Goddard.
Yeah, Drew Goddard wrote the screenplay. And I want to go on record here. A lot of people, so the line, I'm going to science the shit out of it.
Mm-hmm.
People often say, like, Andy, it's the greatest line you ever wrote. I'm like, I didn't write that. That was all Drew. Drew Goddard wrote that. It's in the movie. It's not in the book at all. So this line that I am famous for coming up with, it's Drew Goddard wrote it. He deserves the credit.
You inspired it.
But, yeah, I was going to say, it does speak to how well he was able to get into the voice, I think, of the character. Because it does seem like something Book Watney would say.
Yeah.
If that makes any sense.
Yeah.
I mean, it certainly feels derived from the original material. It doesn't feel like they just kind of added that in or whatever. But yeah, what a great line.
It was a fantastic adaptation, and Matt Damon just completely nailed the role. Like, he just absolutely, when I watch that, I'm like, wow, this is Mark Watney.
That's awesome.
We were just kind of watching it before this interview, and we were just remarking at how well cast everybody is.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Everybody is that person.
Yeah, I just wish they'd used more Kristen Wiig.
Yeah.
I love that character in the book.
Yeah, in the book, she's more central than she is in the film, and in the movie, she doesn't do a single press conference.
Yeah,
like, there are multiple press conferences, there are multiple press interactions, and she is never shown doing any of them.
And
There's always somebody else.
She's got a way more acid tongue too in the book.
Well, yeah. GG.
Yeah.
What was amazing is as we were rewatching it and rereading it, is how much of the dialogue from the book made it word for word into the movie.
Yeah, that was awesome too. Well, Drew really liked the book, so
yeah. Well, I'm sure that helps. I mean, in particular, the conversation that they have in the Hermes when they're making the decision to turn around and go back, like that's almost like verbatim, and it's very cool to see those sync up.
It's like, you're reading that. I could see Jessica Chastain doing those exact lines and everything.
As the resident guy who's seen the Martian movie 500 times, I'm curious to know if you have had a chance to see the extended cut they put out that has like 11 minutes. That's mostly just longer cuts of the same scenes.
I haven't watched the extended cut start to finish, but I have seen those extra scenes that are put in, and I don't think I've seen the longer versions of existing scenes, but I saw the one where he's like the scene where he's kind of on the bouncy ball looking out the window as they approach Earth.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason they cut that was they said, like, this is a great scene. It's too bad we decided to put him on a bouncy ball. That thing's stupid. So they're just like,
well, I personally loved it. And I don't watch it as often as I watch the original, but I do feel like those scenes that are slightly extended by, it's only like 3 to 5 seconds in some cases, but it just kind of lets everything rest a little bit more. A couple of different shots of Watney just pensively looking at something, where it just kind of feels like a little bit more pensive version of the main action film I'm used to seeing over and over and over again.
Yeah. Is there anything from the book that you wished you could have seen in the movie?
Couple of things.
Yeah.
I mean, these are such like teeny little.
Yeah.
But the thing is, in the book, he makes a joke about Aquaman, and in the book, they basically it's like Teddy looks up at the stars and and goes like, oh, he's alone up there. He doesn't know we're alive. What does that do to a man? What's happening in his psychology right now? And then it just cuts. It does a smash cut to Mars, and he's like, how come Aquaman can control whales? It makes no sense.
That reminds me. Mark Watney is like an honorary Cinemasins guy in this. Like, there's so many things he talks about, like the Aquaman thing. There's the Dukes of Hazzard thing, where they're like, why doesn't Boss Hogg just go to their house? Don't let him even get in the General Lee. Yeah.
Right. He also had some choice words to say about that one episode of the $6 Million Man and the Venus probe.
Yeah. So there's that, and what else were you thinking you wanted to see in the movie?
Well, that's the main one, believe it or not.
Mm-hmm.
The only other thing is, like, in the book, a lot more stuff happens on his trip from Ares 3's site to Ares 4's site.
Yeah.
It's he has a lot of problems on the way, but I totally understand why they had to get rid of that, because the movie was already 2 hours and 20 minutes long or something. You can't. Yeah. I mean, you there is such a thing as too much of a good thing, and you don't want a 3.5 hour monolith.
Although I do now.
Yeah.
Sure. Exactly.
The part I miss the most that I wanted to see, and I totally know why it can't be there, is that whole sandstorm thing at the end, where he has to figure out which direction to go in by measuring in like the tiniest degree the air quality, and like one of my favorite, I think, demonstrations of Watney's ingenuity. And I understand why that whole set piece can't be in the movie as they wrote it, but that was probably one of my favorite parts of the whole book.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah.
And I can absolutely understand why they took it out. First off, they just montaged his whole trip, which is fine. And then second off, it's a repeated beat, right? Yeah. I mean, we already had a sandstorm.
Yeah.
And so like having another one is like, all right, even at the time I wrote it, I was like, I'm a little nervous because he's having another sandstorm issue, or,
Yeah, but the way he solves the problem, though, I think that's the main meat of why The Martian works so well, is that we get to see him considering every little detail, and then sometimes even not considering details. That's why he gets into trouble. But the reason why that dust storm thing works so well for me is that he's like, I mean, I know you can't do this in a movie, but he goes 40 kilometers this way, he goes 40 kilometers another way. He's setting up cameras to make sure like how much power they're getting and all that. It would have just been fun, but I mean, I don't know, movie, you're right. I would have tacked on another 20 minutes at least.
Just read the book again.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Although I will say, with the recent sandstorm that basically covered almost the whole surface of Mars, I think it makes it a lot more plausible that there could be another sandstorm, right? That's not like a crazy coincidence.
Right.
Well, Mars has seasonal global dust storms.
Yeah.
The thing that isn't plausible is the sandstorm at the beginning.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Mars's atmosphere is less than 1% of Earth's atmospheric pressure.
Yeah.
And so it does get 150 kilometer an hour winds, but that would, because there's so little inertia behind the atmosphere because it's so thin, it would barely be able to knock over a piece of paper, let alone a 27-ton spaceship.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And so I knew that when I wrote it. I mean, I knew that was just like scientifically inaccurate, but I'm like, I don't care.
Yeah. Sometimes you gotta shoe certain things. You tell the legend,
It's two things. First off, at the time, most people didn't know that.
Yeah.
Then The Martian came out and kind of educated everyone about Mars, and then everybody knew that it was bullshit. But, that my scene was wrong. But that was one thing. The other thing is it's a person versus nature story, and I wanted nature to get the first punch in.
Yeah.
So, but since then, I wish 2020 hindsight. Since then, after The Martian became popular, I got to go to NASA. I got to do all this awesome stuff.
Oh, man.
And I have since learned that Mars has lightning.
Oh, really?
And so I could have had everything start off with a lightning strike.
Nice.
That like a lightning strike hits an oxidizer tank. It's like, whatever. And there's an explosion, which now causes the ship to be in danger of falling over or something like that, you know?
Or you could have been like a stealth sequel to Mission to Mars and had like a giant face appear in a mountain.
Yes. Yes.
And make Don Cheadle go crazy.
With the theme of The Martian.
How much did you have to research to write this book?
Like 7 research.
What's that? That sounds about right. I was going to say probably 8 or 9.
I had to do a ton of research, of course. But that for me is the fun part. And it's hard for me to answer the question of how much research did I do, because as each new thing came up, I would then go spend time researching it. So it's not like I just did a bunch of research and then did a bunch of writing.
Right.
But it took me about 3 years to write the book, and I would say I spent about half my time researching.
Wow. Because the one thing that I think is a good trick of the book is that you make it sound like you have at least Watney has this knowledge just offhand, it doesn't seem like you just looked up a fact and then put it on the paper and that was it. It looked like you just inherently knew a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, it's really easy when you're writing to make a character appear just like super smart, because I spend 3 hours looking something up and Watney's like, oh yeah, no, I mean, this is how this works.
Yeah.
I have a fan on Twitter, a friend on Twitter, who's a botanist, and he did this great thread a month or two ago about. He also loves The Martian, by the way, and told me to tell you hi.
Hi.
But he did this great thread about, now, why did Watney choose the potatoes? You might wonder, why didn't he go with beans, or why didn't he go with this, or what have you? And he basically had like couple dozen tweets in this thread breaking down why potatoes was the right choice in every single instance, whether it was like cycle of growth, or calories or what have you. And I was just like, wow, I love smart people loving smart things.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Well, and Andy, is your back? I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Jeremy.
Sorry, this is Barrett.
Oh, sorry, Barrett. You're all the same.
Yeah. We have very similar sounding voices. Your background's in computer science, right?
Jeremy's voice.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's actually, he doesn't sound quite the same as he does when he's narrating. Because this is his normal conversational voice as opposed to his narration voice.
That's correct. I have to put on the hat to truly be the Sin voice. This is just my everyday Sin voice.
That's right.
Yes.
I see.
No, I was going to ask, your background is not in astrophysics, right? Or in space stuff. Your background's in computer science, right?
Yeah, I was a computer programmer for about 25 years.
Oh, wow.
And now I do full-time writing, and I liked programming computers. I was a happy little cubicle dweller. I've never had a problem with that. I liked that job. I hung on to my last programming job longer than I should have. Like, I was already The Martian was already on the bestseller list. The movie was already in production.
Yeah.
I liked it. But I've always been a space dork, So in the same way that, you take somebody who's, I don't know, a gearhead, someone who's way into cars, they're more knowledgeable about cars. Mm-hmm. So they could write about that. And, so everybody is knowledgeable in their hobbies.
Ah, right. Yeah. That's pretty good. I noticed I'm partway through Artemis. I'm the one in the room that hasn't finished it because everyone else borrowed my copy to read it and prep for this, and I got it back and haven't gotten But one thing I love about both that and The Martian is where you choose to set this in terms of it's science fiction to me, but it's set in such a near future that it feels plausible. And I feel like a lot of science fiction writers will take us light years away to some other planet or hundreds or thousands of years into the future, or if you're George Lucas, into the past, to tell these fantastical sci-fi stories. And I am really drawn to your writing because it feels so plausible. And I'm curious if you're intentionally writing in that world or just your first two stories happen to be that.
Well, I really like near future. The short answer is it's intentional. The longer answer is I like hard sci-fi. I like writing science fiction with plausible science in it. The further into the future you go, the more, seemingly magical technology there would be. So in other words, let's say I was in Jules Verne's era, let's say I was writing back then, I wouldn't want, if I had written something that took place in the 2000s, there's so much technology that has been invented since the 1880s that it would be just really, really difficult to explain that world, and it would not seem plausible to people, even if I was exactly perfectly on. I'm like, here's the internet. There's this thing called Wikipedia. There's this loser channel called Cinemasins.
Yes.
But when it's super near future, then it's just here's the science we have, and then here's very kind of slight advancements in that and where that takes us. And it feels more real and tangible to the reader. Yeah. Or at least that's what I hope.
Well, particularly the space tourism on Artemis or the lunar tourism. I read that the paper that was attached to my copy of Artemis about how you settled on the price point, economic reality of it. Of $70,000, you could actually feasibly do this as a middle classer. And details like that, I think, are what inform a more compelling story, because you can relate to it. If it's 1,000,000 or 1,000 years in the future, it's more difficult to relate to that reality.
Yeah. Specifically with Artemis, the biggest problem I had when I was conceptualizing it is I started off by saying, I want a story that takes place on the moon, in a city on the moon. That's what I want. Give me a moon city. And then I'm like, well, why the hell would anyone build a city on the moon? That was my main problem. Is because all the traditional science fiction answers to that question kind of leave me unsatisfied. It's people, they did it because they want to mine the moon for resources. I'm like, well, first off, there's literally nothing on the moon that isn't also all over the place on Earth except possibly helium-3. But even then, send robots. Why would you send human beings? We're soft, we're squishy. You have to bring the humans back when you're done with them. It's like a terrible way of doing anything. We're the worst possible mechanism. And so I'm like, send robots. And then, so other explanations are like, population pressure, made people, start colonizing the moon. I'm like, did you colonize the ocean? Did you colonize the Sahara? Did you colonize Antarctica? Like, all of those are easier than colonizing the moon. All of those are so much easier than colonizing the moon.
Yeah.
And then, the next thing is like, political strife. Like, people, an oppressed class went off to live in the moon, kind of like, the Pilgrims and whatever. And I'm like, okay, if you can afford to build a city in the moon, you're not the oppressed people.
Yeah.
So the thing I came up with is like, every city in human history has some economic reason for being there. So I'm like, there has to be some economic reason that makes sense. And the only reason I could think of like, what is there an economic reason for a bunch of humans to be on the moon? I thought, okay, tourism. So I built it all around that. And then to make that work, I said like, okay, well, I need to know which way the technology is going to go. Like, how cheap is it? Like right now it's super expensive to get into space, but how cheap could it get?
Mm-hmm.
And then I did that. I wrote a whole article it's on businessinsider.com if anyone wants to read it, where I did this analysis of, this is the one that you guys were just talking about, where I did this whole analysis and I projected the commercial space industry forward. And I made the core assumption of, what if the commercial space industry was as efficient as the commercial airline industry?
Mm-hmm.
And I just defined efficient as meaning spends the same percentage of its money on fuel.
Right. And
everything kind of worked out from there. That's the really fun thing about being a hard sci-fi author is I try to come up with just, the rules of like, okay, this works this way, that works that way. Now do a bunch of math and find out what happens.
Right.
And it's that's the fun part for me is like the science kind of writes the plot for me in a lot of cases. Well,
sure. Yeah. The everything grows out of that tourism element of it, because that's the story, and that's how Jazz and everybody gets involved with this. I would like to thank you for introducing me to the term moon poon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Trust fund boys looking for moon poon.
Yeah, I mean it's just interesting to see, like, because it's not just the feature of going to the moon as part of the tourism industry up there. There's also prostitution and gambling and like luxury hotels and stuff like that. And that just
the three pillars of a society.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But yeah, it really fleshes it out, and that story just works so perfectly in there.
Do you imagine it's possible that the events of Artemis and the events of the Martian are taking place in the same universe, or is this just a whole different thing for you?
Legally, I can't say that. The thing is, for books, it actually kind of sucks for writers in this fashion. Is that so? Like, The Martian was a big success and stuff like that. All sorts of different entities own any derivative rights, right? So, like, if I made a sequel to The Martian, then these people would automatically have, right of first refusal on an audiobook. And these people would automatically have right of, on film rights. And this publisher would blah, 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 blah. So it activates clauses in all these contracts.
Well, I don't want to make you do that.
It's so needlessly complicated.
But if you write a new unique work, then it's like, everything's there. But so I leave it up to the reader's imagination to decide for themselves whether or not they take place in the same universe.
The answer is yes.
All right.
But for us, the answer is yes.
I choose to believe.
So you have written an interesting character here. This Jasmine Bashara character. She is a Saudi Arabian heroine, and it's and I'm wondering, do you have anybody in mind in your head who would play this character in an American film?
Well, people ask me that question all the time,
right.
And I never really know how to answer, because believe it or not, when I'm writing, I don't have a cinematic view of the events that are taking place.
Okay.
It's all just kind of blobs and concepts, and and which is also kind of how I am when I'm reading books. And so, like, when I finished The Martian, and I was completely done with it, I couldn't have told you what color Mark Watney's hair was. Like, I don't visualize the characters that way. Now, for Jazz, all I would want is someone who can pass for Saudi Arabian, like, ethnically wise. So someone who's about the right skin tone, an olive complexioned lady.
Yeah.
And someone who's within a decade or so of 26 years old.
Right.
which is Jazz is 26 during the events of the story, and so that's about all I need. And of course, it would, this is the easy part is Jazz is supposed to be fairly attractive, but Hollywood generally pretty good at finding attractive
I don't
people.
think you have a problem with it.
So what you're saying is Scarlett Johansson.
Yes.
Yeah.
It might as well be, right? She might as well have another controversy with us.
Yeah. Yeah, well, if Scarlett Johansson, she's not the right skin color, we'll just put makeup on her. No,
Yeah, why not?
What could go wrong?
Why not?
Darken her skin a little bit. I don't think anybody would take offense at that.
One thing that I think is interesting is that the audio book has Rosario Dawson. And,
yeah.
And I was like, wow, she would be a pretty good Jazz, I think.
She would be a pretty good Jazz, yeah.
Yeah.
I think she'd do a great job. She certainly did a great job narrating Jazz, like being Jazz in the first person narration.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
She's always great, though.
Yeah. I mean, love me some Rosario Dawson.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about movies, if you don't mind. Like your tastes.
Do you guys like movies?
Yeah. Like what are some of your favorite movies and why? And do you think they inform your writing? Freeform conversation. Go.
Okay. Well, my favorite genre of film is sci-fi, of course. Big shock there.
Yeah, I'm shocked.
And it doesn't have to be scientifically accurate stuff for me to enjoy it. I don't care. It's like my particular brand is that I write hard sci-fi, but I don't care if it's, really, really soft. I like Star Wars, and Star Wars is, let's be honest, fantasy, right?
Yeah.
It's got wizards and sword fighters. It's fantasy, right? And I love it. And I love Star Trek films, old and new, and the TV shows and all that stuff like that. So I love sci-fi in almost all of its flavors. I also really like kind of noir films and stuff like that. And Artemis has a little bit of that. It's like kind of the put upon detective, although Jazz isn't like a private eye, but it's that sort of thing. People often ask, what are your inspirations on this, that, and the other thing? One of my favorite movies of all time is Chinatown.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Love that film. I think it's like one of the best movies ever made, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And that is the main inspiration for Artemis.
Yeah.
Yeah, makes sense.
And at first you're like, what? But then it's like, Chinatown is about the ugly, nasty crap that has to happen under the surface for a city to grow.
Mm.
Yeah, for a city to get big. In Chinatown, it's all about the water, getting into Los Angeles. But in Artemis, it's all about this sudden tumultuous change to its economy. Trying not to give away too many spoilers.
Yeah.
But that is looming on the horizon, and all the machinations surrounding that.
Well, and plus it's rich companies who want to get richer somehow.
Well,
they already print money on this, on the doing the things that they do, providing stuff that only they can provide.
Although I do need to let you know, Andy, that on this show, because of my error in not remembering the title Chinatown, we call that movie the incest movie.
Mm-hmm. The incest movie,
yeah.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
My daughter, my sister, my daughter.
Yes.
No, that's awesome. That makes perfect sense now that you say that, and we love Chinatown. That's one of our favorite movies.
Not enough to remember its title, though.
Nope.
Okay.
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
No. Well,
it's kind of like Macbeth is the Scottish play.
Yeah.
Isn't
it asking us a little much to know the titles of things?
It's one of my character traits on this podcast to not be able to remember things all the time.
That's one of my character traits in this life.
Yeah.
So you're not alone.
Yeah,
my wife serves as my long-term memory.
Excellent.
We'll be out somewhere, and I'm like, when we get home, honey, remind me I have to take the cans out to the garbage out because it's trash day. She's like, okay, because I know I'm not going to remember it beyond that moment.
Yeah. I was
like a goldfish.
I am wondering, I know that you've probably been asked this a million times, but I want to sort of frame it and hopefully that you, in a way that you haven't been asked it before. But I'm going to start with a really common question. What was your inspiration to write The Martian? But the question I have is, did you see sort of a dearth in this kind of science fiction writing, and that's the reason why you felt like you needed to write this? because I feel like if someone else writes The Martian, who writes, like your regular everyday sci-fi, Mark Watney's not a character who sits there and thinks about things and thinks about all the, details and all that. It's just everything just kind of comes to him naturally or whatever, and we don't have to worry about all those things. So did you see sort of a void in that kind of writing?
Well, I'll answer the first question first because it's actually much simpler for me to answer.
Okay.
The inspiration for The Martian was, like I said, I'm a space dork. This is my hobby. It's my interest. I'm one of those guys who's, I have like, JPL.org, like bookmarks so that I can see what's new coming up. And when they were building Curiosity, like they had a webcam up in the White Room that, in the high bay, as it's called, and I just had that up on a second monitor at work all day. So I'd be doing my work and I'd glance over and see what they're doing on Curiosity today. And it was just a live feed. I mean, that's the level of space dork I am. And so while that was, I was sitting around thinking like, I want to design a manned mission to Mars. So not for a book or anything like that. I was just like, okay, so I want to come up with like, how could we do, just speculate. Okay, well, how do we get people there? How do we get them back? How do we make sure they don't die? And the mission plan has to account for failures. Like, okay, what if this thing breaks? What's the backup? What if this thing breaks? What if these two things fail at the same time? Like, how do you make sure the mission is robust enough to handle these failures without risking the crew's lives and without needing to abort at the first sign of trouble? Like, have ways like, okay, this went wrong, but we can fix it and continue the mission, that sort of stuff. And then I started thinking of like, well, what if this happens, and then this could be really bad and stuff like that. And the kind of progressively desperate things a crew would have to do to survive in these scenarios, I started to realize might make for a good book. And so I created an unfortunate protagonist and subjected him to all of them.
Oh my God! You tortured the poor bastard.
Yeah, no, I'm a vengeful, mean god. And so you should never put me in charge of a universe. I'll have unhappy people. So that was the inspiration of The Martian. Now you did touch on something else. You said, do you see that there's a dearth of this sort of thing? Is that why you wrote it? That is not why I wrote it. It's just I had this idea and I wrote it.
Yeah.
But so that's not what motivated me to write this kind of thing. However, I will say I do definitely feel there is a dearth in it.
Yeah.
I feel like sci-fi recently, well, a few things. First off, there's almost no hard science fiction out there these days.
Right.
In the old days, we had like my holy trinity, Asimov, Heinlein, and Clarke were cranking out these stories that were kind of like, oh, they take place like 100 or 150 years in the future. There's like rockets and stuff, but everything obeys physics,
Right.
Not everything. There's faster than light travel and stuff in some of the books, but some of them are really pretty solid. For the science they had at the time. And that seems to have gone away. And I miss that. I grew up reading those books because they were my father's science fiction collection. And so I miss that. So that's kind of what sci-fi is for me. And the other thing, and I'm sure you guys have noted this probably many times in the past, is that science fiction has been hijacked by these bleak dystopian misery-scapes.
Yeah, yeah.
And it seems like everything has to be like nowadays, like every view of the future is like, okay, well, this techno-fascist regime in charge and the only hope, everybody's miserable. And for some reason, teenagers have to do weird shit.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't buy into that. First, I can understand why. Evil fascist regimes are a very simple way of creating conflict. Like, you immediately understand it. Nobody has to sit and think about it. Oh, maybe this regime's good for the economy. It's like, no, nobody has to think about it. They're like, oh, okay, these are kind of pseudo-Nazis. They're the bad guys. These people are the good guys. The bad guys have all the power. The good guys have almost nothing but their wits and their determination to work with. And it's just like this prefab plot that you can drop into anything.
Yeah.
So I understand why they do it. But I also firmly believe that that's not how technology works. There's this, I don't mind, space Nazis or whatever. I like them as much as the next guy. I like a good, like, hey, show me some I'm ready to grab my popcorn, sit down, watch a movie where there's unambiguous evil and unambiguous good, and they fight and good wins. You know, I don't need, you know, anything deeper than that to be happy and entertained.
Yeah.
But what I don't like is this feeling of technophobia that seems to permeate science fiction nowadays. Like where the idea is that like all technology is basically evil, or humans are so evil that like as soon as we come up with technology, we will, the worst possible outcome will happen.
Right.
And so that's, or in other words, every single episode of Black Mirror.
Right? Yeah, exactly.
Well, what do you think? I'm sorry.
Well, I'm still ranting.
Sorry.
And then, and whereas I would say like 5,000 years of human history has shown that that's not true.
Mm-hmm.
Like I often say to people, I'm like, name a technology, any technology in human history that has done more harm than good overall. And people might immediately say, well, nuclear bombs. I'm like, well, nuclear power, right?
Yeah.
Nuclear bombs have been responsible for the deaths of like, you know, like about 250,000 people total. And I'm like, but nuclear power, how many coal miners didn't die because, you know, we had nuclear power to run our civilization? How much better is the environment because of nuclear power? Or how much better is this, that, and the other thing? And just the scientific advancements that came from it. It's like, it's better.
Yeah.
And literally everything is it's very, very difficult to find a technology. Even people say like, okay, well, you know, genetically engineered viruses, you know, for bioweapons. And I'm like, has anyone ever actually used that?
Yeah.
Right. And meanwhile, genetically engineered viruses are being used to treat cancer and being used to deal with, you know, genetic, you know, therapy. And so anyway, I also firmly believe that the future is always better than the past. If you ask someone, where would you rather be alive, now or 100 years ago, or 200 years ago, or 300 years ago? They'll say, well, now. And I say, like, well, what if you're not allowed to choose now? You have to go back at least 100 years. They'll be like, well, I'll go back just 100 years. Everybody would want to be as far forward in time as possible. Because humanity and our world just keeps becoming a better and better and better place to live. And 100 years from now, people will be like, no, I don't want to live in 2018. 2118 is so much better.
So, well, that has to be true.
Well, it's interesting because I was reading that story Digitocracy that you published in Medium, and I wanted to get your thoughts on how you think, because this is not quite a dystopic future, but it is a future where AI essentially runs everything. And when you get a unicorn movie that's also based on technology, but also smart and beautiful, Ex Machina is what I'm thinking about. What are your thoughts on how AI is getting integrated into our society, singularity, all that stuff, like how that's going to turn out? Do you think this is another technology that will almost certainly be a benefit to society, even at the expense of humanity?
Yes, 100%. This view of like the singularity is like the end of the world. The computers will take over, and it's Judgment Day, and it's Skynet. You know, and I'm like, no, it's a tool. You know, eventually they'll have computers that are smarter than humans. Okay, just make your peace with that. It's only a matter of time. Okay, but then what happens with those computers that are smarter than humans? Someone eventually will say like, and I still say everything comes back to economics. All the important events in human history are driven by economics. Eventually, there will be computers that can run and manage an economy better than any humans can. And we won't even understand why it works so well. It just does. Right. And it's just like it does. It's like the computers are like, yeah, I ran 743 billion different like scenarios, and the best way to improve our economy is to increase barley production by 0.04%. Just trust me, you know, and it's like you do that, everything works out great. And so, and it won't even be considered odd. It's like, if you ask your computer what the square root of some 10-digit number is, it'll tell you in, you know, under a second. And you'll just trust that it's correct, right? You don't go like, well, I want to see your methodology.
Show your math.
And so, I think it's only a matter of time. And also just think of all the things that like computers that are smarter than humans, think of all the things they could do. You go in, you have like an AI doctor and it's like, okay, you know, give it a blood test and stuff like that. tell me about your symptoms. Tell me what you're feeling. Da, 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 da. Oh yeah, you have you have malaria aggravated by rickets. Here.
So in other words, WebMD, right?
Big Hero
Right,
6.
yeah, right. Well, no,
Big Hero
WebMD
6.
is you always have cancer, AIDS, or cancerous AIDS.
Right.
But,
Oh, I hope I never get malaria rickets.
Yes.
malaria rickets. Yeah.
Oh,
But yeah, if you just imagine that, and I honestly think that, and here's a weird thought. People aren't thinking of how much computers are going to affect entertainment. How long will it be before computers can make music that's more beautiful than any human has made?
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Right?
Well, there's a guy I read about this week who's trying to make a movie with one of the characters being played by a digital AI creation or some kind of CGI. Again, that's not AI for per se, but how long until computers are creating better visual medium art than we can?
That's the other thing, as I was imagining, is so how long, as a writer, one of my questions is how long until computers can write better stories than humans can? And people say like, well, that doesn't make any sense. Stories are very high-end conceptual. It's basically computers don't think along those ways. Well, that's what they used to say about computers playing Go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. So how long until you have an AI that sits there and says like, okay, so I've read every book ever published, and I've found the themes and the commonalities among the ones that people like, and the commonalities among the ones that people don't like. And I've read all the reviews to get a feel of what parts of books they like. And so here's what I've come up with as these are popular plots, and these are popular character traits, and these are things like that. And so now I'm going to put these pieces together to make a story that humans will really enjoy.
Man, wouldn't it be cool if somebody did that and didn't tell anyone? And that book went to the top of the bestseller list, and then they revealed it. God, that would be awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's you're on to me. And then the next thing is, so we're already getting to the point where CGI characters they're still a little bit in the uncanny valley, but they're almost climbing out of it, right?
Yeah.
And so how long until that gets basically indistinguishable from humans, like with no problem at all? That's probably pretty close. And then the next thing is how long until computers can just say like, oh, give me 20 minutes and I'll make you a movie that's better than Citizen Kane.
Yeah.
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 It's like, just give me, and I'll write it. This one stars like, Humphrey Bogart and Elijah Wood. And,
That's pretty good. Man, and you're saying this is inevitable, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's only a matter of time before a lot of creative pursuits computers end up better at them.
Well, and they'll be cheaper too, right? So the people who care about, like studios already only care about money.
Sure.
Once they can hire a computer to make Fast and Furious 10 instead of humans, it'll be a lot cheaper for them to do so.
Isn't it already made by computers?
Half by computers.
Then the next question is how long until studios are basically put out of business because my PC at home can make better movies?
Yeah, that's
that
crazy.
may be the only bright, silver lining in this killing off of creative jobs.
You know what I've heard these kind of
and how long until I can get my a perfect AI that'll do snarky movie reviews?
Yeah, that's true.
There you go.
Damn it, you got us.
I have heard this. Oh, that would be
35 seconds of fucking logos.
That would be beautiful. Oh my God. If there's any legacy Cinemasins has, it will be that some robot can just do this shit in its sleep.
God. I would actually walk away, man. I would have never thought this shit was eternal anyway.
It brings up a question. I've heard this future prediction type of thing before where robots going to be doing everything. And I don't think I've ever heard what we're going to be doing when that happens, though.
Chilling.
We're just gonna be chilling,
we'll be like in WALL-E.
I wonder if there'll be any need for us to do anything, or if there, can we really just chill?
Is a post-scarcity society,
and
that is, in my opinion, there will come a time in the future, and this is further out than we're gonna see. I think it's beyond my lifespan, but there will come a time in the future where we are post-scarcity, which means that like literally every aspect of providing for human needs is fully automated. Mm-hmm. And the maintenance of those aspects are also fully automated. And so at this point, humans don't have to work anymore. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You don't have to do a job. And so that's not a new concept. That's called post-scarcity. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you guys have read the Ian Banks books, the Culture series. They all take place in a post-scarcity kind of world. And it's really hard for people like us from our era to imagine that world because we identify so much of our own personal identity is wrapped up in our professions.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And that would no longer be the case. So if you just imagine like high society or people who are like so wealthy that they don't have to do anything, but they still do stuff.
Yeah.
Right. Not just leisure activities. They do things that they're passionate about. They work hard on things even though they don't have to.
Right.
But that would be what humanity is like.
Because, yeah, there would still be a need for humans to want to write books and make movies, even though all the robots are doing it. And there would still be a need for people to go out and plant a garden, even though they don't need to.
Well, again, you're still thinking along the lines of someone, from our civilization, where it's like, in what way can I do things that benefit, that provide things for myself or others? Mm-hmm. But that would no longer be the case.
Yeah.
It would then become, what do I enjoy? I need to be introspective. How can I find happiness? Like, there's lots of different things I can do. Mm-hmm. I want to find out. Oh, it turns out I really enjoy parachuting. Okay, I'm going to do that.
I'm going to do that all the time.
Well, until I get bored of it, and
right.
I'll work on to something else. But people will find meaning in things other than their professions, and that's a really interesting thing to explore. I decided not. I mean, I've thought about that, but I decided not to do that in my fiction because, like, I'm more about the science and less about the psychology. Mm-hmm. And so other better writers could handle that stuff. Me, I'm all about the science.
This is why we have you on the podcast today, is we are enlightened about things and never thought about it in a different way before. And that is, I will now be thinking about this for weeks.
Yes, I will as well.
It's a bright future, though. Wouldn't you like to live there?
Yes.
Where it's like, you don't have to work.
Where you get up and you're just like, I'm just going to do whatever I want today.
But how do I ensure, I'm half serious, by the way. How do I ensure, what happens to, like, if I want a steak, how do I get that steak? The robot's going to make it for me, sure. But do I have to pay for it? Is everything free in this place?
Why would you? Well, just imagine it. I mean, like, so we're talking about, so post-scarcity means no scarcity. It means, so think about your oxygen consumption. Mm-hmm. You don't pay for it. You need it. If you don't get it, you'll die. Mm-hmm. But it's just there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm with you. I wasn't expecting to have school today, but I'm enjoying it. No, I guess you're right. So nobody needs to pay for anything anymore, and everybody can just be free to pursue whatever makes them happy. That's right. There's still going to be gobs of conflict between humans in that.
Yeah, there's still going to be people who don't like what other people are doing. There's still going to be ideological differences. There's still going to be divides.
Yeah.
But also, depending on how far into the post-scarcity world you are, the computers will be like, no, you don't get to kill each other. Sorry. I mean, you can argue, but no.
Man, isn't that essentially Star Trek, though? Like a post-scarcity type of universe?
I
don't know.
Earth in the Star Trek universe itself is post-scarcity, but it is part of a galaxy that is not. Right. So if you take the Earth from the Star Trek universe and isolate it and put it in a galaxy where that's the only life, then that's a post-scarcity society.
So we'd all have time to do deep space exploration.
There you go.
Yeah.
There you go.
If that was your thing.
It reminds me of the ship in WALL-E. Like everybody's just hanging out, eating food, getting fat.
That ship was post-scarcity, right?
Yeah.
Everything was automated.
Yeah.
The actual humans, their only job is just to chill.
Yeah. I was getting back to what you were talking about there, the pessimistic view in sci-fi and everything. That's one of the subtexts, I believe, of both of your books, is that there's an optimistic view of what is going on. I think about this world that where we're just regularly sending manned Mars missions like every so many years or whatever. And we've got everything plotted out, like the government's on it. It's a publicly owned space, all this other type of stuff. And the same thing with Artemis. It's like, all right, we're just going to the moon now. We're just hanging out on the moon. There's people there who are there to, provide service for you and everything. That's one thing I don't think I see in many sci-fi things. That's the I don't know, sort of an enjoyment of reading what you've put down to paper so far.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I really do have an optimistic view of the future. I honestly do. I also have an optimistic view of humanity. I think that we're pretty good. We're pretty good as a species goes. And you see the negative aspects of it on the news all the time. But the reason you see the negative aspects of it is that when people are being assholes to each other, it's newsworthy.
Yeah,
because it is so presumed and common for people to be cooperative that it's abnormal when they're not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so like, yeah, it's hard sometimes to read something like this in this day and age where we've, I don't know how many years ago it was where the government just stopped funding NASA, and then but then we have Elon Musk come out of nowhere and say, I want to start doing this type of thing. There's your optimism right there, is that there are still people who have the money and wherewithal to do it without NASA,
Yeah. I mean, I'm maybe 5% of the space nerd that you are. But I mean, how awesome has it been the last few years to watch them send up rockets and land those fuckers back on Earth or on that barge? I mean, I remember like the first time I actually watched it live, I went to Twitter and I was like, SpaceX! And like everybody was like, what are you talking about? And I was like, come on, that's amazing! Like, how geeked out are you about that?
Yeah, I'm super geeked out about it. I honestly think that so now we're moving into my space geekery, not my general views of humanity. But, I think the way forward in space is to drive down the price to low Earth orbit. I still believe, people think that this is a cynicism I have, which is at odds with my optimism, but I still honestly believe that all the major events in history and all the major movements of humans are driven by economics. And so I think that the key to having humans all over the place in space, on the moon, Mars, and all around our solar system, it lies in driving down the price to get out of Earth's gravity well.
Yeah.
And that's what companies like SpaceX are working on. I mean, that's Musk's general philosophy, as I understand it, is basically like, hey, look, if we make it cheap enough to get into low Earth orbit, a market will arise for the product.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you see that happening?
Yeah, they're driving down the price all the time. They're always coming out. One of the many awesome benefits of being the author of The Martian is that like I got to go to Johnson Space Center, and I also got to go to SpaceX. They brought me in there for like VIP tours and stuff like that. And like it was interesting, the stark differences between the two. Like NASA's a research facility. I mean, it's got lots of scientists, chalkboards, lab coats, and pocket protectors galore. Whereas like, SpaceX is a rocket factory. They are a production line. They're like, okay, over here is where we make this. Over here is where we make this. We're all non-union because we don't want to deal with that crap. And the diameter of our boosters is driven by how wide we can move things around on trucks. So we don't have to rely on rail, so we can just drive things, down the freeway.
Wow.
And it's all modular for transport. We build things on their side, not vertically, so we don't need a giant vehicle assembly plant. We just need a wide warehouse, which is much easier to arrange. It's amazing. At one end here is where they're making the little parts, and at this end is where they're assembling rockets, And it's just, they're doing everything they can. They also say the most expensive part of any company are its employees. So everything they're doing is trying to minimize the number of humans that are necessary to make a spacecraft. It's like they're like, okay, could this be automated? Can this be, how can we minimize the number of people it takes? And that doesn't mean they'd lay off their people. It just means that with X people, we can now make more rockets,
Yeah.
So I've got a question about Artemis in particular. This is Barrett again. It seems like, especially for such a small town, it seems like such a rich well to draw stories from, and especially how it ends. Do you see yourself going back to that universe again?
Absolutely. I would love to write sequels and just additional books in Artemis from like other characters' points of view. For instance, not just following Jazz around all the time, but like, someone else, maybe a new character, or Rudy. I'd like to write a book that revolves around Rudy, the cop.
Yeah.
And I actually pitched an idea to my publisher. On the heels of Artemis, I pitched an idea where it's basically a murder mystery, and Rudy was the main character. And they didn't like it.
Oh, no, come on.
Bastards.
It also had the best imaginable title. I was going to call it Murder on the Moon. And believe it or not, that has never been the title of anything.
Really?
Unbelievable.
It is unbelievable.
Murder on
It's
the
never
Moon.
been a book, movie.
Your publishers turned that down? Come on.
I know.
You know what? They turned it down because you haven't written it yet. That's why they turned it down.
I wrote a chapter 1 and I gave it to him, and I'm like, this is general feel. And my editor was like, okay, this is an interesting story, but the novelty of Artemis will have worn off for the reader by the time they read this. So now Artemis is a city. It's interesting. There's cool stuff going on, but just the idea of having a city on the moon is no longer in itself this exciting thing that'll pull the reader through. And what you have in mind here is a murder mystery. And you're not like, your strength is in like science and stuff like that. Now you're talking about writing a murder mystery, and we just don't think it would be received that well.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask you this. I want to get nosy. Are you working on anything new that you can talk about?
Yes, I'm working on stuff. No, I can't really talk about it. I've got, I am on the horns of a dilemma. I have 2 different, completely unrelated ideas for my next book, and I'm trying to decide which way to go. And so what I'm doing, what you've caught me in the middle of right now, is I'm a big fan of writing chapter 1. So if you have an idea, write chapter 1 and see how it feels. So I wrote chapter 1 for the first one. Now I'm working on chapter 1 for the other one. And I'll just see how it feels.
Here's what you should do. You should get an AI that is as good at writing books as you are, and have it write one and you write the other. Then let the public decide, man.
That's right.
Which one's better?
If I had one of those AIs, I would do exactly what you were saying. I would have it crank out a book, and then I'd present that as my own work. And then, I'd wait a year and have it crank out another one.
There you go.
And I would kill no one.
Are you planning on being involved in the production of Artemis the movie?
My plans are not relevant. My only job was to cash the check.
There you go.
But I would love to be involved in any capacity that they want. But usually, as the writer of the book, you don't even have to. On The Martian, they called and asked me a lot of science questions when they were doing it. Drew asked me a lot of questions. And some creative from Drew when he was working on the screenplay, but mostly just science stuff. And during the actual filming itself, I get questions filtered through from Ridley Scott about like, oh, what if we showed this and that and the other thing? Would that be scientifically accurate? And I'm like, yes or no. Or,
Well, I mean, it's hard to, a lot of times for us to just kind of imagine what all these things look like and how they operate and everything. Like the first time I read The Martian, I must have sat on one page for like 10 minutes trying to just absorb every single little thing, to try to figure this out.
That makes that a failure on my part, then.
No,
you should be able to just read at a normal pace. If I've made it that complicated.
Well, no, I did it the second time. I ran through it a little bit faster and everything. But I don't think I sit around thinking of these things often enough that when it came up, I was like, okay, so he has to open the airlock from here, and then he has to do this, and then there's the thing that just separates nitrogen and oxygen, and there's all this, the pressure is involved and all that. I was like, okay, all right, now I gotta think about this for a second. It doesn't make the story bad or hard to read or anything. It just makes it more interesting for me. And I don't know, maybe that brings up another question. Do you find that you have a lot of people who have a hard time getting into that book because of that?
Well, what I discovered, so first off, the history is that I wrote it as a labor of love, and I was posting it a chapter at a time to my website. That's where The Martian came from.
Yeah.
And then it was only like later that it became like a big, and I had a regular readership of about 3,000 hardcore nerds from my previous things that I'd posted on my website, science stuff, comics, whatever.
Yeah.
So I was writing The Martian for them, like hardcore dorks who want to see the math, I had no idea it would have any mainstream appeal. And what I discovered, and this was completely, unintentional on my part, is it worked out perfectly because the people who aren't as interested in the science or math just kind of skimmed the parts that explained that. They're like, yeah, whatever. There's a bunch of numbers going on right here, but I'm sure they're right.
Yeah.
And that itself is actually pretty cool when the reader has enough faith in you that they'll just take it for granted that there's no hand waving going on.
Right. Yeah.
And so it gives an authenticity to the story when the reader reaches that point. That's like, you can't buy that level of trust. It's awesome. It's like, yeah.
I feel like it's similar. I was a big Tom Clancy reader in the 90s, and I would do this, like whenever he would get into one of those 3 or 4 pages describing the aircraft carrier,
right.
I would kind of do that, skim over it to get back to the story part. But I know that part of what his core hardcore fans really appreciated about him was that level of detail, the research he put into it, the knowledge he had of military vehicles and how everything operates in there. I know that's what drew a lot of his core audience to those books.
Yeah, that's what we in the industry call serial number porn, which is basically where you have like this level of authenticity where
yeah,
that's awesome term for it.
But I do feel like there is a balance though. Like it's not just dense statistics for like 5 pages. It's
right.
pretty quickly summarized. Like
that's the challenge when you're into something that the audience may or may not be into. Like, I like the science, I like the math, I like understanding the physics behind stuff and the chemistry behind stuff, and also I'm an economics dork. And these are all things that most people aren't, especially economics. And that's a good example of a challenge for me. Is like, just like talk about physics in The Martian. I needed the reader to understand the problem. Whatever the problem du jour that Mark was having. But I also needed the book to not read like a Wikipedia page.
Yeah.
Right. So it's a real balance. And it's hard for me because I could ramble on about physics all day. And the trick to writing is write something that you yourself would enjoy reading.
Yeah.
But you also have to know that, like, okay, I would love to read like 10 pages in describing in excruciating detail the physics and chemistry behind this. Most readers won't. Yeah. So I just need to give them just the information that they need to understand the problem, and then not get crazy after that. As for economics, very few people, like, more people are interested in hearing about the science behind things than they are in hearing about the economics behind things. Right. But Artemis, one of the key plot lines revolves around economics.
Right.
So I had to kind of describe some economics, but don't get too deep into it, or just kind of be funny when you do, and just go for the broad strokes. Anyone who wants to dig deeper can go online and read my articles about it. But man, I mean, if we learned one thing from The Phantom Menace, it's, don't start a story with a prolonged description of supply side economics. Right?
It's so true, so true.
I mean, when you put it in the voices that you have though with Jazz and Mark, they're so acerbic, and there'll be times where they'll say, like, long story short, here's what I'm facing right here. And I think you do such a good job of conforming to that voice. And obviously, I think Jeremy mentioned that there seems to be almost a little bit of overlap between Jazz and Mark in terms of, their sarcasm and their wit and things like that. Is there a lot of you in those characters?
Absolutely. Mark is definitely, he's the idealized me. He's all the parts of my personality that I like about myself, and none of the bad stuff. So he's the idealized version of me. And Jazz is a little bit more the real me. she's got flaws, she's got regrets, she's allegedly very intelligent, but also makes a lot of bad life decisions.
Yeah.
And so they're both based on just kind of different parts of my personality.
Do you do a lot of reading? Do you have much time for reading?
It's sad, not anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, it's weird. It's like once you, and I've heard this from other authors too, it's like once you get into the point where you're full-time writing, a lot of authors, myself included, just kind of stop reading.
Yeah.
It's because it becomes kind of like a busman's holiday. You know, you spend all day writing and then reading your own work and editing and stuff like that. You're kind of like a little fatigued on reading when it's time for leisure time.
Yeah.
So I actually spend a lot of time just watching TV and movies. That's how I like to. That's how I consume entertainment. On the consumer side.
What are some shows that you're really into right now?
Well, I'm not, for some reason, I'm not yet sick of superhero stuff. So, I like, for TV show, I like the CW, various, the Arrowverse stuff.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
And I like, I also like the Marvel stuff on Netflix.
Oh, great.
And then I am still enjoying, I'm kind of running out, but I'm still liking a lot of the cinematic, the Marvel, the MCU stuff. And although, I mean, like I liked Infinity War, I wasn't that excited by the other Avengers movies, but I like the surrounding movies. I really liked Doctor Strange. I really liked, Ragnarok, and so it's kind of hit or miss for me on those.
Sure. No, I get that.
They seem to strangely be getting better, I think. Like it's an odd thing when when movies get to even 4 or 5, they start really losing a lot of steam, but this is an 18, 19 now. So
well, what happened was I think one of the reasons Infinity War was so enjoyable, or at least certainly to me, I thought it was awesome, is because they could come into the movie with the assumption that you already know all these characters, you already know their powers, you already know their backstories. So they didn't have to put any time or effort into exposition at all.
Right.
And so now you're just seeing like 20 well-known characters all doing their thing, and they could just move straight into the action.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so it was just like 2.5 hours of just like, this is happening.
Yeah. Yeah. Get used to it.
Whereas like things like Civil War, I mean, in the comics, it was this big kind of chess match between kind of Captain America and Tony Stark and all this stuff going on here, there, and the other place, and in the movie, it was kind of like a brawl in a 7-Eleven parking lot.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or an airport.
It was just like, well, that happened,
I got at least a couple of writing related questions because on my off days, I fancy myself somewhat of a writer. And so I'm curious to know for you personally, I know what it is for me, but what does it take for an idea to go from something in your brain to something you've decided to put to paper? Now, I know you mentioned you like doing chapter 1s. That may be your answer to this question, is to see how the chapter 1 goes and how you feel. But how do you know an idea is one that you want to pursue and actually write as opposed to one of many you might come back to later?
That's an interesting question. I'm not sure how to answer that. I have a really tough time with that process, as you can tell, because I go so far as to write a chapter, to kind of like see how I feel. I've got a big pile of chapter 1s in my, on my hard drive.
No lie, you could publish a collection of your chapter 1s and it would be a bestseller, and I would read the shit out of
it. And then have an online poll for which one should be a book.
There you go.
Yeah, I vote for Murder on the Moon.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, so I guess the thing is, first off, if you've got an idea, the first question is like, how much time do you spend daydreaming about it? Yeah. If you keep coming back to it, if you keep like thinking about it and thinking about the ramifications of it, and then this could happen, or maybe that could happen, then that's a good sign. Like that means if it's that interesting to you, there's a good chance it'll be that interesting to the reader.
Yeah.
Another thing is like you have to see if it has legs. Do you just have a plot twist and nothing really else? Or do you just have kind of an interesting concept, but you're not sure where to go with it? Because I've certainly had a lot of those. You got to think about like, how does this, where is the conflict in this? Where are the problems that the protagonist has to solve or survive or whatever? And like, how do what is the climax? What is the conclusion? Just the super broad strokes. Like, what's the story here?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then you got to see, then for me, the next big challenge is this a story that's been told like 1,000 times with, a different coat of paint on it?
Yeah.
Because I've come up with all sorts of ideas where someone has a superpower, but I always end up falling back into, this generic superhero movie concept of like, oh, some guy gets his powers and then, he gets to play with his powers for a while, but then a villain arises and then they're in conflict. And I'm like, that story's been done so many times. I try to come up with something a little more unique.
And then they get into a big fight in an airport hangar.
Then they get in a big fight in an airport hangar. Yeah.
I know that you've met Neil deGrasse Tyson a few different times. Maybe for all I know, you guys are like best buddies now. But he guested on a few Sins videos back in the day.
Yeah, including The Martian.
Yeah, and including The Martian. And
I watched that one.
You'd watch that one? Do you have any gripes with our nitpicks?
No, not at all.
Yeah, I didn't figure. We got to meet him.
No, I watched literally every one of your videos.
Oh,
that raises a whole bunch of.
I think one came out just today, I think.
Right.
Yeah.
I haven't seen the one from today yet.
That actually raises another question. Why?
Yeah, Cowboys and Aliens came out today. I haven't seen that one.
No, it's weird because we have this conflict between people that we like that don't like us. And then there's people that we like who do like us. And so I don't know where that balance is. I die inside when people I like are like coming on Twitter and like, fuck Cinemasins. But when somebody like you is like, I've watched every video, I'm like, really? Why?
I don't know. It's entertaining. It's funny.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's such sweet. I will live on that for a long time.
I'm telling you, man, it will carry a lot more than you think it will. Because you're sort of, I love a lot of things about you. I love that you weren't an overnight sensation. You didn't write The Martian, hand it to a publisher, and they went, stamp, gold. You were plugging away, writing on your website for years, for, like you said, for your core audience, and you didn't even write The Martian with the idea of becoming a best-selling author and having it turned into a movie. And yet you have accomplished now what anyone like myself who's ever written a book wants to do. You've crossed over. You have had a bestseller, and now you get to go to movie premieres. You get to do interviews with Neil deGrasse Tyson. You've probably met Matt Damon.
I have.
I know. I saw on social media you met George R.R. Martin. I mean, it's hard enough for me to rationalize our success on YouTube. How insane is your life compared to 6 years ago? And does it even feel real?
It's weird. It's like, it's the new normal. It's amazing how quickly you just kind of get used to stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, I've got a bunch more money now. That's cool.
Yeah,
that's cool.
And I get to spend all day like doing what I've always wanted to do. I always wanted to be a writer ever since I was a kid.
Yeah.
I mean, the reason I went into engineering is because I also like regular meals. I mean,
yeah.
But yeah, I don't know. I just kind of it does seem like, what really seems like a daydream to me, or just so like surreal, is the time, like right when The Martian was being made, when they were shooting it and doing post-production, and then when it was out in theaters, that whole thing just seems like, did that actually happen?
Yeah, imagine so.
Yeah, it was like, was I really at a red carpet event with like Matt Damon and Jessica Chastain and yeah, no, I was. And then I went home and fed the cats, and it's just like,
I think there's something to be said for because you're clearly down to earth. You clearly haven't like become a diva with this level of success, and I think there's something to be said for finding success, in your 30s and 40s, as opposed to like at 18, when it's, I think, much easier to slip down the slope of being an asshole. Whereas,
I think that's absolutely true.
Yeah.
I had the good fortune of having about, let's see, when did The Martian come out? The book came out in 2014, so I was 42 years old. So I'd had 42 years of of life reminding me that I'm like, of getting my face kicked in here and there.
Yeah.
So, so I got to become a mature human and stuff like that before I got success, which is good.
I think so. I think Jeremy and I talk about, like, if we had made this channel when we were 22 or something like that, we'd probably be insufferable at, like,
I'm serious.
Yeah.
Not only that, I would have spent what money we have made on stupid shit like Lamborghinis and like video phones.
You'd be Jake Paul.
Yeah, I would.
Would be Jake Paul.
And I'm glad I'm not.
Mm-hmm.
I remember when I was about 20, my friends and I designed a submarine. We were going to, like, just for fun, we designed, like, we could build a submarine. And like, we worked out it would cost about $50,000 to buy the parts and materials to build it. And I was like, man, if I ever have $50,000, I'm going to do this. And I'm like, I'm glad I didn't have $50,000 because I probably would have drowned that next day, right?
Yeah.
All right. Well, anything else, guys? I don't want to waste this man's time. I know that it's slotted to go long, but I don't want to just.
I feel like, honestly, I could talk with you forever, but it's one of those things where, we're doing a show here, I guess. And I mean, we could talk about, we could just shoot the shit, but I don't know how.
I mean, I could easily go, hey, let's talk more about how much you like our videos.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I do.
I'm really.
Well, I'll tell you. I mean, I like the running gags in them. So, to the people who watch all the videos, just the running gags. That anybody who's eating an apple is automatically an asshole.
There's one in this video that just came out today.
It's amazing how often that happens.
Well, these cliches are cliches for a reason.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I just personally wanted to thank you for taking even 5 minutes of your time, and you've taken a lot longer than that. And it means a lot to me. I'm a fan of yours. I look forward to what you put out next, and maybe we can have you back on when Artemis is having its world premiere or something.
I'm telling you, I look forward to how this is visualized, because you mentioned that you're not really keeping a cinematic landscape in mind when you're writing these things, but I could easily see how it would translate to that. I mean,
in my mind, it's like hard to think about like what the inside of Artemis looks like, especially in like the Aldrin Arcade, the area that's like the main shopping area. Yeah. I almost imagine it looking like kind of a futuristic mall.
Yeah. That's how I visualized it too. It is interesting because on these, I don't know how much you have to do with this, but obviously on the copies of the books, they've got the maps on the front end of it. And I was constantly going back and referring to, this is where the Apollo landing site is in relation to this. And, very, very cool stuff.
Yeah. I love maps. I love that shit. I love using the geography of the real, planetoid, Mars or the moon and stuff like that.
That's kind of obvious even in The Martian, where he's just looking at this like horrible readout from something from like with 1996 or something like that. He can barely read it, but I can see the enthusiasm you have for maps even in that, because it's not even easy to read, but he's like, yeah, all right. All these things are exciting.
There's a map in the front of The Martian too.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I think that's going to be a thing for me, maps. But, I wanted to do, like, when I wanted to do the sequel to Artemis, I wanted to have like the updated map. I would like to have like a whole series of Artemis books, and in front of each one is the map of the ever-growing city. And
so they would add new bubbles and things like that?
Of course.
Yeah.
And the next
awesome.
This was going to take place about 3 years after the first one, and it's like now there's the Mitchell bubble, which is the next astronaut in the sequence to name a thing after.
Yeah, that's always an interesting thing when you crack open a book for the first time. You see all these drawings and maps and stuff, and you're like, how does this factor in? And you get about 50 pages in, you're like, okay, well, I know what this is. How does this ever get in?
Well, it's also like, cool to see how relative to each other. Like,
but then by the time you get about 150, 200 pages in, you go back and refer to it and like, oh, okay, I know where everything else is now.
Yeah, I get it.
It's great.
So that's where Mordor is. Okay.
Exactly. Oh my God, I can't tell you how many times I would look at that map.
That is the king of all referred back to maps.
Oh my God.
Yeah, J.R.R. Tolkien was a guy who came up with a setting and then grudgingly wrote a story in it.
Yeah.
But he came up with like 10,000 years of history that you never even hear about unless you read the Silmarillion. And only complete dorks would read that. You guys certainly have.
Yeah.
You've got like 6 copies of the Silmarillion, don't you?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
And, well, I know you guys are being polite and trying to let me go, but I did want to... if you're willing, and I don't know if you touch on this stuff in your podcast, but I've always admired kind of Jeremy about mental health stuff.
Let's do it. Let's do it, man.
So I mean, Jeremy, we talked about that a little bit on email, you and I there's a real stigma about mental health, and I think it's good when folks like you or anybody else who has a megaphone kind of says look, it's okay to have a mental health issue and these are medical issues and just go get help. It doesn't mean you are a failure as a human being or something like that any more than if you had a broken leg, you'd get medical help for that. And it's just I don't know. I like your approach to it. You do it generally on your own channel, right, Jeremy? On your own social media. I'm not sure.
Well, I mean, the Cinemasins social media has basically morphed into Jeremy's Twitter, at least on Twitter. And that's where I do most of it. We've done a couple of notes in a video. I think when we did a special shirt for Mental Health Month, we might have mentioned it in it. I'm really glad that you brought that up. It's not the kind of thing that we can sit down and say live with a guest. Hey, do you have any mental health things that you want to talk about? Or do you want?
I do.
I would love to hear anything you want to say. All that you've said already is very encouraging, and I'm glad that you wanted to spend extra time talking about that.
So my whole life, in my younger years, I had real problems with depression. In my 20s and early 30s, and sleep 15 hours a day. Only begrudgingly eat because eventually I have to. Smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day. It just people would say smoking's bad for you, it'll kill you, and I'm like, okay, when? And, and I had real problems with that. I had a breakup with a girlfriend back in college, and it set off an episode that lasted for a year. And it was after a while, I was like, okay, this is way too much to be explained by me just having a breakup. I've seen other people break up and they don't, it's kind of I started to realize there's something different, there's something wrong going on. And unfortunately at the time it was kind of the early 90s. And back then, the way most therapists or whatever, the way the kind of medical industry dealt with depression was suck it up. I mean, I actively tried to seek help. I went to therapists and stuff like that. And they didn't, they were just oh, well, you're sad. And I mean, they understood there was this concept of there is such a thing as depression and there is clinical depression, but it was still really new.
Yeah.
And then, over time that turned into anxiety, which is actually, I've had anxiety problems my whole life. That was about a depression that eventually kind of went away. And I've got to believe there was some brain chemistry involved because your early 20s is kind of when your brain chemistry starts to really change, I think. But then it became anxiety, and I've had a lifelong problem with anxiety. And that was even harder to get any sort of help with, because once people start taking depression seriously and they're like, oh, okay, we've got Prozac, we've got all these things to try to help with depression, they still weren't the medical world wasn't really taking anxiety seriously. They're like, what, you're nervous? Well, it's they'd say oh, well, we're going to teach you some breathing exercises, which to anyone who has chronic anxiety, I can tell you is kind of like throwing a bucket of water on a forest fire. It's okay, I was at a 10, now I'm at a 9.9998. It didn't freaking help. But finally I did find the right therapy, and it ends up being just an anti-anxiety med that it's actually an antidepressant that I take. It's I don't know if you guys don't want brand names said on the
that's
thing.
fine. We don't shy away from it.
It's Zoloft, which is sertraline is the chemical name, and that's usually prescribed for depression. But depression and anxiety are two sides of the same coin. They're the same kind of chemical malfunction in your brain. And so things that can be used to treat one are often used to treat the other. And in my case, it really helped a lot. And it just kind of like, it's not like I, popped a pill and I'm like, wow, everything's great. It's like after 6 weeks of going like, well, these pills aren't really doing anything. I don't feel any different. One day I was like driving to IKEA and I was like, I remember the last time I drove here, I was super stressed out about how to get into the parking lot and how to navigate the parking lot. Like last time I was like white knuckling my steering wheel because I was so worked up. And this time I'm just dealing with it. And that's kind of like that's what anti-anxiety medication does. You don't even realize it's working until you find yourself in a situation that used to really get you worked up. And now it's just like, you're the normal amount of worked up. And I guess this prolonged ramble is just to say, keep working at it. Like if you have problems with anxiety or depression, it's like having a physical malady. It's like having a broken leg. And oftentimes the first one or two doctors you go to talk about it will not be that useful. And if you feel like you're not getting the help you need, if you feel like things aren't improving, then keep pursuing other doctors until you find what you need. And that may or may not be medication, but until you find a way to improve, keep working at it.
Yeah.
And then the other thing I would say is that medication is great. There have been a lot of advances in it, but you also have to do the therapy. I talk to a therapist every week. I talk to him over Skype. So my work schedule has me traveling around a lot, but I Skype with my therapist every week.
Yeah.
And so for that, I would say back to the broken leg analogy, you break your leg, you go to the doctor, you get it fixed. That's the same as the meds that you take, right?
Yeah.
And then you have to do physical therapy to be able to really use leg. You can't just ignore that part of it. And so you have to do the work. You have to go to therapy. So there's my little spiel.
Man, that's better than the whole previous rest of the show, in my opinion, honestly. Because if I'm going to do one thing right with this platform that we've been allowed to have, it's going to be to promote mental health awareness and to try and destigmatize it. And you're totally right that you have to keep at it. I was blessed, lucky, fortunate to have found a doctor who did not have any stigma with anxiety. I didn't even go to her for anxiety. I went to her for chest pains and started rattling off some other things. And she said, "Oh, you have anxiety." But the first thing she prescribed for me was Zoloft.
Okay.
And it didn't work very well for me. It actually worked really well with the anxiety, but knocked me out. I needed like a 4-hour nap every day. And so I had to go back and try a different medication. I'm on Prestique now, which works really well for me. But even that took a couple of weeks to get into my system. And we had to play with the dose. And
see, that's good. You got to let everybody know about that. That it's a trial and error problem. I got lucky in that the first med that we tried worked. And had I didn't have the side effects that you have. And so then I was in good shape. But different brains are different, and so if you have a doctor who's helping you out, they'll say like, try this for a while. And then if it doesn't seem to be working, don't come. It's very easy, especially, when you're an anxious or depressive person, it's very easy to come to the conclusion to get hopeless, to go like, well, even the meds didn't work. I give up. Well, don't give up. It's just that med didn't work. Move on to the next one. They got more meds than you have lifespan.
Well, and even I would also add, even finding a therapist can be a process. I'm on my second therapist. I've been with him for about 3 years and super happy. A friend of mine is on her 6th therapist and very happy now, but there's a chemistry element and there's an experience element. And again, every brain is different. Every therapist is different. But what we want to mostly encourage is if you feel like you might have some kind of anxiety or depression or any other mental health issue, to see a doctor, get it checked out, seek therapy and treatment. And there are resources. I know a lot of people will tell me immediately, I can't afford to do that. And I understand that. The Prestique has now gone generic for me. Thank God. It's like $25. But before that, it was $400 a month because my insurance didn't want to cover it and it was expensive as hell. So I get that. I'm not trying to suggest, everybody can afford every level of care, but there are resources out there in almost every community that are free, that can point you in the direction of counseling services, help for paying for medications and doctor bills, and then, of course, just at least talk to someone. Maybe even Andy Weir. Maybe he'll pick up the phone when you call him.
Yeah, I myself, I don't even know what number this therapist is. I had to go through a bunch, but this one, the one that I have now, is great. I've been talking to him for I think 10 years.
Wow, that's outstanding. Yeah. Wow. That's great. That's great. Man, it means so much to me that you wanted to say that. I wish I could give you a big old hug right now. That's so important to me, and I'm glad that you wanted to talk about it.
We're finally seeing, he's giving a hug through the Skype there. It's an interesting age. We've been seeing athletes coming out about this, actors coming out about this, and everything. It's finally sort of getting this to the forefront, because I think for people who don't experience these type of things, when you see it for the first time,
understand it.
Yeah, when you see it for the first time, you're like, wait a minute, why are you so stressed out and acting this way and everything? It doesn't make any sense to somebody who observes it.
Well, it's also changed how it's being portrayed in movies and TV. We just finished watching that Sharp Objects show, and that delves into a lot of things that you wouldn't normally see on the screen and how that's portrayed. So we actually did a whole podcast on this, Andy, about a year ago. We talked about mental health and how it's portrayed in movies and how that's evolved over time. But yeah, the more it's talked about, the more it's portrayed in a realistic format, the better it's going to be.
Yep.
Yeah. And that spurred a thought, but I lost it. Oh well.
Well, it's interesting,
the older I get, the more that happens.
My background, this is Barrett. My background is in psychiatry, actually, and when I see things that are in movies that are inaccurate or used in different ways, it drives me crazy. Probably the same way that something like gravity and the debris racing at them, even though they're in the same orbit.
I call it the protagonist seeking debris field.
Exactly. I mean, when you see, we just watched Rampage and did a video on it recently, and they used this genetic editing tool called CRISPR-Cas9, which I'm sure you're familiar with, as a mechanism to turn the apes into monsters.
Yes.
And I've dealt with this thing in the lab in animals and things like that. And it's insane the way that they're using it. Drives me crazy.
All right. Well, that'll do it for this episode. We'd like to thank Andy Weir for coming in and talking to us.
Thanks for having me.
That's amazing. If you haven't read The Martian, read Artemis. They're both great.
Yes. Yep.
I had 5 stars all the way. If you have a 5-star rating, or
even
whatever.
if you've seen the movie a million times, The Martian, you'll still get something out of reading the book. It's really, really great.
I saw the movie first and then read the book later, and it's a great experience that way. Anyway, keep going to Sincast, presented by Cinemasins on Facebook. Go to Twitter, go to Reddit. There's a billion different, with SoundCloud, there's a bunch of different ways to get to us. But that'll do it for this week. It's Chris Atkins and Jeremy Scott, Barrett Scher, and Andy Weir. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening. Comment on our episodes on our SoundCloud page. Check us out on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, and Reddit. And be sure to visit cinemasins.com.
I'm just looking at a poster of American Beauty. I don't actually see any humans.
Can you use Greenwich Mean Time, please, Andy?
I'm good till 3 a.m.
Okay.
No, it's the other way. It's the other way. They're ahead. So I'm good until 7 p.m. GMT. Okay. 1900 GMT.
There we go.
I'm glad we got that covered.